Well, in the final hours before Jesus' arrest, he has a final meal with his closest disciples. You can sense the urgency in his words and as he repeats things that he wants them to not forget. These are things that he's taught them throughout the years, and even though he's reminding them, he realizes they're not going to feel the full weight of his words until after he's gone. But you sense that urgency as he repeats over and over and emphasizes to them and says, don't miss this. And that's the title of our series as we walk towards Easter and as we get his words in our minds and our hearts. And Rob kicked it off a couple of weeks ago as we talked about Jesus' persistent and sacrificial love, and he modeled it for them in a way that was a bit shocking, in that he took off his outer garment and he wrapped a towel around him and he walked around and he washed their feet, an act that was reserved for a slave typically. And then last week, Nathaniel talked about Jesus' bold statement where he said, I am the way to God. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It was a significant claim where he was declaring himself God. And this week, we build on that idea, and we're going to dive right in because there's a lot to cover. I want you to grab a Bible. We're going to be in the chapter of John, or Gospel of John, chapters 15 and 16. So if you grab one of our Bibles, it's on page 897. You can also grab your Bible app. And I want to say welcome to those who are online. So John chapter 15, verse 1. Jesus says this, I'm the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so that they will produce even more. Now, when Jesus describes himself as a grapevine, he's using a metaphor that men who lived and understood an agricultural world way more than we do, we get that. But this is more than just an agricultural metaphor for them. You see, the vine was often used as an image for the nation and the people of Israel. Israel was a covenant people with God, which meant that they had a commitment to one another. And covenant's not a word that we use often. Probably the closest thing is that we have in our world is a commitment that a husband and wife to make to one another in marriage. It's intended to be an unbreakable commitment. And they were supposed to be a people that were tended by God, and they were intended to live in such a way that the nations and the peoples around them would see what a just people look like that were ruled by a loving Heavenly Father. But honestly, it didn't work. They continued to fail over and over, and more often than not, they look like the people and the nations surrounding them. So when Jesus declares himself the vine, he is saying that he's the new Israel and that everyone that is connected to him, everyone that's a branch of his, are the new people of God. It's a very provocative statement that they wouldn't have missed. And then he begins to talk about pruning, and pruning so that these branches can be more fruitful. And again, they would have been familiar with this world, but anybody that has had fruit trees and been around them, you know that you prune branches, you concentrate the work of the nourishment of the vine into fewer branches so that it's more productive, it produces bigger and stronger fruit. So Jesus continues in verse 3 when he says, you've already been pruned and purified by the message I've given you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. Now, this idea to remain, sometimes it's translated abide. It can mean dwell or live. But it implies relationship and connection, and not casual relationship, but intimate relationship. In fact, what Jesus is describing here is what some would describe as reciprocal abiding. We remain in Christ, and he remains in us. And it's a reflection and a picture of the kind of relationship that God has within himself as Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And we're invited into that relationship. And when we surrender our lives to Jesus, and we're saved, that's where we enter into that relationship. And that's a really important truth that if you're not familiar with, if you didn't hear Nathaniel's message from last week, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. But sometimes the church has got so focused on the message of John 14 that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, that they miss out on the importance of living out what John has preached or John has recorded in John 15. That we need to live in an ongoing, life-giving relationship with Jesus. Because what Jesus describes here is more than mere metaphor. It's what we're intended to experience, what we're intended to live out. And when we don't do this, it's a little bit like somebody who goes and would get married, and after the wedding, they don't have connection or relationship with the person that they're married to. But as we remain connected to Jesus, we experience a new kind of life that flows out of that relationship. When we abide in Jesus, we discover who we were created to be. And when we forget, he helps us remember who we are. And we begin to change from the inside out. In fact, Jesus says this. He says, those who remain in me will produce much fruit. And he repeats this idea 7 times through the passage that we're reading today. Now, what does he mean by fruit? He's talking about our character. He's talking about the decisions that we make, including the obedience that we live out in our lives. He's talking about acts of kindness and service for others. He's talking about every good thing that flows out of our lives. And I think one of the challenges that we experience as followers of Jesus is when we surrender our lives, we begin to try to muster up these things on our own. And yeah, it does take effort on our part, but it's not just about us mustering up our effort. It's about being connected with him. Because as we're connected with him, as we live life with him, that change begins to flow out of us. You see, Jesus has called us to live fruitful lives born out of loving relationship with him. And this only can happen as we stay connected with him. You know, most of us have probably had the experience where we've trimmed trees and cut branches. And if you cut branches off and you left them laying at the base of a tree and come back a couple of weeks later, we wouldn't expect to see those branches with, nice leaves on them or fruit. We would assume that any leaves that were there would have withered up, and the branches themselves would begin to die. And I wonder why we think that we'll be any different. And Jesus reminds us not just once, but he tells them again in verses 5 through 8. And I'm not going to read it, but this is important, that we remain in him and that he remains in us. But this leads to a question: how do we actually do that? And I think Jesus begins to describe to them what it looks like to live in that kind of relationship in the verses that follow. And I think there's 2 critical ideas in here, or 2 critical things that he wants us to experience that are easy to miss as we read these passages, because Jesus begins to talk about love and joy. And I think there are words that are easy for us to hear, but sometimes, particularly the word love, can almost be meaningless. And so we're going to spend a little time diving into this after we read his words in verse 9. Jesus said, I have loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you these things so that you will be filled with joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. A couple of weeks ago, I had a friend give me the book, and he had no idea that I was preparing for this passage. And the book was interesting, partly because I trust my friend. He regularly sends me articles or things to read. But the book was talking about how people grow in their faith. And it was co-written by a discipleship pastor and another man who describes himself as a neurotheologian. And he's got a master's degree in theology, but he has a PhD in psychology. And so he understands how the brain works. And this book grew out of a conversation between this discipleship pastor who was frustrated at his own lack of growth and the lack of growth in the people that he was responsible to care for. And it grew out of their conversation as this neurotheologian talks about how we experience growth and change. And the book talks all about the importance of love and joy and healthy community to our spiritual growth as individuals and as the health of the church. And they begin to talk about the same kind of love that Jesus is talking about. You know, there's a variety of words, Greek words, that can be used to describe love, because love can be such a generic word, like I said, that can be used to describe so many things. But the word that John uses to record Jesus' thoughts in this passage is the word agape, which means unconditional love. It's a committed love that never quits, that's full of mercy and grace. It's the kind of love that God has for each one of us, and he wants us to fully experience that. And Jesus knows when we believe and we experience that we are loved unconditionally, that begins to change us. I'm going to read a couple of selections from this book because I think they challenge our thinking in this regard and sometimes the ways that we operate as the church. The book says, in modern thinking, character is transformed by truth, correct living, and good choices. However, this formula does not translate into character formation. I do not want to imply that truth and choice are unimportant. The error is believing that thinking by itself forms character. Now, I don't have time to go into all the background in this, but during the Enlightenment, mind and reason were elevated almost to the exclusion of everything else. And through that, we began to believe that it was the most important thing. Again, don't hear me saying that truth is unimportant. But when we elevate truth above love, we begin to make a mistake. And I think sometimes when we think that we can argue people into faith instead of loving them into faith, like Jesus called us to do, we make that mistake. Because I can know what's absolutely true, and it doesn't change me. Anybody who has been a parent or anybody that's worked with kids knows you can tell them this is what the right thing to do is, but they don't always do it. And often in church, we do the very same thing. We teach people truth, but we need to experience Jesus' love, because real change comes from knowing the truth and loving relationship. And it's not just how we're loved, but what we love in return. And remember that reciprocal abiding that Jesus talked about in verse 3? Another passage from the book that talks about this. It says, our brain draws life from our strongest relational connections to grow our character and shape our identity. Who we love shapes who we are. And I would add what we love, because sometimes we love the what. It's why so often in the Bible we're warned and reminded to love God and not love idols or other things. It's why Jesus warned us to not love money, because when we give our love to something else, it begins to change us and shape who we are, and our life grows out of that. So love is an important idea, something we need to not just know about, but we need to experience in our lives. And part of the way we experience that, these authors go on to share, is through the experience of joy. Now, joy is an emotion, and it's connected with what we love and what we desire. And the interesting thing about joy is it's described as a supra emotion. It's an emotion that can exist alongside of other emotions. It's why we can experience grief, and in the midst of that, experience joy and peace at the same time. And we were made to find joy in God and in other people. Again, the authors describe this. They say, our brains desire joy more than any other thing. And as we go through our day, our brains are scanning our surroundings, looking for people who are happy to be with us. Our faces reflect what we love and what brings us joy. And you know, this starts with an infant. And again, anybody that's been a parent, as you hold that little baby, or if you hold somebody else's baby and you begin to look in their faces, there's that moment where they look up at you and smile, and there's something that stirs in your heart. There's joy that happens through that connection. And babies begin to develop their identity as they look at their parents' faces, as they see faces, and it begins to program their brains, those joyful connections. It's part of why when our kids were little, I loved to come home because I knew I would come in through the garage door and I would often see one of them running towards me and their little face would light up. And it was the most joyful part of my day. Now I come home and the dog is there to greet me. It's not quite the same thing. But it is why Susie and I, she's often upstairs working, it's why we intentionally try to pause and greet one another when we come home. Either I come home or she comes home. Which, by the way, a related topic to this that, again, could be a whole other message is our brains are wired to tell the difference between virtual faces and real faces. And this is a real challenge as we begin to spend so much of our life in front of screens instead of other people. But you know, this idea increases the importance of what we do. What I see happen on every Sunday morning, we've got greeters standing out front that are facing the people that are walking in. And they're there to welcome them and greet them with a smile. And we do the same thing in Grace Kids and down the Students' Hall. And it communicates not just, I'm glad that you're here, but even if the person doesn't fully know it, it communicates you're loved and delighted in by God. And it's one of the things that I love to see happening in this room and in the lobby after the service ends. Often as the service wraps up and we conclude, I see people turning towards one another and they're greeting one another, they're talking, and they're sharing stories. And it's why it's important that we invest not just in what happens on Sunday morning, but we invest in relationship through small groups. Now, I want to take a moment and actually practice this. Now, we don't do this very often, so sorry, introverts, but I want you to turn to somebody and simply say, I'm glad to see you. I'm glad to see you. Let me just say, well done. I thought I was going to have to encourage you to do it a second time, but you guys really are getting into this. But as I read about the brain science, I began to reflect on the scriptures. And one of the things that I began to notice is God's face is throughout the scriptures, particularly the Old Testament. And I thought of a priestly prayer that we used to sing over our kids at night that begins, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. And I thought about Moses in the story as he went on the mountain and he spent time on God. When he came down from the mountain, his face would glow. It didn't say his whole body glowed. There was something in his face that reflected the glory of God that his face picked up and reflected. It was so much so that he had to wear a veil when he came down off the mountain. And the authors, their interpretations of those verses that I just read from 9 through 11 that just happened to be in this book, this is the way they would have us read those verses. And again, this is not a translation, but it's their interpretation of these words. And this is Jesus saying this to his disciples. My Father's face lights up when he sees me because I'm so special to him. I'm telling you this so you will feel how special you are to me and to my Father and to me. Our faces are shining on you with delight. Again, picture the scene. Jesus is sitting around the table. The scriptures tell us he couldn't wait to gather with them. And he knew this was his last moment to sit around the table with the men that he had journeyed with for 3 years and to remind them how important he was to them and how much he loved them. So why am I sharing this? Why am I spending so much time on just a few verses? Well, I think it's easy as we read these verses to kind of read them and kind of zip through them because love and joy, again, sometimes we can use those words and they almost don't have any meaning or weight. But Jesus knew that his disciples were going to need that sense of joy that he was leaving them with for what they were going to face in the days ahead. And Jesus knows that we need that same joy as well. The other reason that I'm sharing this is because for a long time, I could have told you that Jesus loved me and it was here, But I don't know that I totally believed it here. And I would say it's really just been in the past 5 years that I've begun to understand his love and delight in me in a different way. And by the way, one of the things that they suggest for us to just practice joy, besides looking people in the face and smiling, is the practice of gratitude, remembering the way that God has demonstrated his goodness to us. It's in the practice of gratitude that we begin to remember and experience God's joy and delight in us. Well, Jesus continues and he shares in verse 12, he says, "This is my commandment. Love each other in the same way that I've loved you. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." You see, this life that flows into us from Jesus changes us, but it's not just for us. It's intended to flow from our lives into the lives of the people around us. And it's also part of how we experience that agape love, that unconditional love, is as we love others and as they love us back. You see, we were made for community, and we need one another, and Jesus is calling them to live that out with each other. And again, I think as they were hearing these words, they had a fresh memory of Jesus' act of sacrifice and service as they washed his feet. But I wonder what John thought about as he reflected on Jesus' words later after he'd seen Jesus willingly sacrifice himself on the cross, and he thought about Jesus' willingness to sacrifice even at that level. And in the years ahead, these same disciples that heard that call and heard that command, that invitation to lay down their lives, they literally did that. In fact, church tradition tells us that of the remaining disciples, John, who wrote this gospel, was the only one who lived to a ripe old age. The others were martyred because of their love for Jesus. They were willing to sacrifice. Now, this can be a lot of pressure, this idea of loving like Jesus and living lives that are fruitful. And again, I think sometimes we feel the pressure and we wonder, okay, what do I need to do and how do I live this out? And we feel this pressure, but Jesus is reminding them of one other thing as he talks to them. And he reminds them in verse 15 how they were originally called. He says, "You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce lasting fruit so that my Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name." Again, he reminds them of this command, love each other. And again, what we often miss is that Jesus is reminding them of how he called each one of them. You see, in that day, it wasn't uncommon for a rabbi to take on disciples, but the way it happened was a little different than it happened with Jesus' disciples. Somebody that was interested in living as a disciple, when they would finish up their schooling, they would find a rabbi that they were interested in following, and they would go to that rabbi and they would ask permission to become one of his disciples. And the rabbi would assess them and either tell them, yes, you can follow me, or they would say, no, I don't think you have what it takes. And they would go off and either find another rabbi, or more likely they would head off to practice a trade. And the way Jesus went about calling his disciples was much different. He went and found them and he called them. And he's reminding them that this idea wasn't their idea, that he called them. This was his idea, that this is ultimately his work and his life that he's pouring into them. He's reminding them that at some level the pressure's off. He's saying, I called you into this and you need to follow me. Now we're going to continue on in the passage, but again, this first part is where I've spent most of the time, I think is really, really important. But there's a couple of more ideas that Jesus wants to get across, that he wants them to be prepared for what's going to come ahead. And the next is he reminds them that as they try to follow him, they're going to face challenges. And in verse 18, Jesus says, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. The world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it. But you are no longer part of this world. I chose you to come out of the world, so it hates you. Now, Jesus used a Greek word for world that sounds like cosmos, and I'm not a Greek scholar, but It sounds very similar to our word for cosmos, and it's where we get our word cosmos from. And it can mean three things. It can mean the universe. This word can mean the universe, kind of like the way we use the word cosmos. It can also mean the physical world where we live. But I really think what Jesus meant was the way that this third definition, it means present order, the way the world works right now. And there's a lot encompassed when Jesus is talking about the world or the opposition that they're going to face. He's talking about all the brokenness in the world, from the micro to the macro, from the personal to systemic, that's opposed to this new order that Jesus is trying to create. He's talking about our personal brokenness, hatred and division and moral failure. He's even talking about the brokenness that comes from our decaying bodies and our minds. But he's also talking about systemic injustice and brokenness, things that operate, systems that operate in the world that oppose this world that Jesus is trying to bring about. And then he's also talking about spiritual forces of evil that Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 6. In fact, Jesus, a little bit later in John chapter 16, verse 11, references the ruler of this world. And I think sometimes we wonder, why is it when I'm trying to do something good, it's so hard? You know, I'm just trying to do a simple thing and it's a good thing. And Jesus reminds them, when you try to live like I've called you to do, it will be difficult because you are going to face opposition. He's reminding them that they're going into battle. And it's part of why our women's group have been studying the armor of God this semester. They're being reminded that living the way that Jesus calls us to live isn't easy. It's difficult and will face opposition. Now, one last idea that Jesus wants to get across to them before he leaves. And this is that they're not going to be alone even after he leaves. And we're going to jump down to chapter 16, verse 5. And this part could probably deserve its own message, but I don't have fully time to cover it. Jesus is talking throughout about his spirit that he's sending to them. And he says this, "But now I'm going away to the one who sent me." He's talking about returning to God, to the Father. "And not one of you is asking me where I'm going. Instead, you grieve because of what I've told you. But in fact, it is best for you that I go away, because if I don't, the advocate won't come. If I do go away, then I will send him to you. There is so much more that I want to tell you, but you can't bear it now. But when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. He will not speak on his own, but he will tell you what he has heard. He will tell you about the future." And then he says, "All that belongs to the Father is mine. This is why I said the Spirit will tell you whatever he receives from me." So Jesus is reminding them, his disciples, that this life that he's calling them to experience, they'll experience as his Spirit comes into them and fills them, and they begin to live this life out in the world. And then Jesus' final words, the final things that he says to them before that night is over. "But the time is coming," and I'm in verse 32, "indeed it's here now, when you will be scattered, each one going its own way, leaving me alone. Yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me." And then his very final words, because John chapter 17 is a prayer, his final words before his arrest: "I have told you all of this so that you will have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world." He leaves them with words of hope. And he leaves them with these words, the reminder that he calls us to live fruitful lives born out of loving relationship with him. But he also reminds them that as we do that, we're going to experience both joy and opposition. Now, how do we do that? Again, I think John recorded the details of this conversation, and it wasn't just for the historical record. These words were intended for us. So I'm going to give you a couple of practical things that I would encourage you to do this week. And the first application is we simply need to learn how to cultivate love and joy in our lives. And as you go throughout your week, here's what I would encourage you to do. Simply be intentional about looking people in the face and smiling. Try to share, without words even, just the joy and the delight, particularly those people that are close to you. But I think the second thing is that we need to step into is we need to experience that joy ourselves, because if we don't, we're just faking it. So a really practical thing, and this is a great way to practice and prepare for Easter, is to read the verses, all this passage from John 13 through 17, and don't rush through it. But read those words and picture yourself sitting at that table with the other disciples and Jesus speaking those words to you. Are there words that he would emphasize that you uniquely want to hear or you need to hear? You know, John calls himself the disciple that Jesus loved. And I think that's in some ways was his way of saying, I was Jesus' favorite. Now, the other disciples were all dead, so nobody could dispute it. But I suspect that Jesus wants us all to feel that way. That if we were sitting in front of him, that we would feel like his favorite. That he loves us, that he delights in us. You know, I had a friend give me, the same friend, I had breakfast with him a couple of days later after he gave me this book, and he gave me this little token. It simply says, may you feel the love, or may you feel the joy of God's face shining on you because he's happy with you. And if there's one thing that I would invite you to leave with today, and I can't give this to you, only he can, is that my prayer is that you would begin to experience that joy. Now, as we enter into a time of response, and obviously the band is here and they're going to begin to sing, I want to invite you to take whatever posture is comfortable for you as they lead us. If you just need to sit and hear these words of this song and have it sung over you, then just sit and receive those words. But maybe you want to stand and participate in the singing of the song, and I would encourage you to feel free to do that. Or maybe you need to move. Maybe you need to go stand next to a friend or put an arm around him. Maybe you need to go pray or kneel in front of the cross. Maybe you need to take communion. There's communion if you want to participate in that, like there is every week after the service. But we call this a response song, and I just want you to know you have freedom to respond in however God leads you. There's one more thing that I'm going to invite you to do. And for me, as I've been listening and preparing for this sermon all week, a topic that has just been apparent has been the idea of hunger. The spiritual hunger that God is stirring in the hearts of men and women to experience more. And experience that kind of love that Jesus has for us. And if you're somebody that wants to experience that love at some point during this response song, I would just encourage you to raise your hand, and it's between you and him. Nobody's going to know if you're just worshiping or if you're raising your hand. But I am confident that there are people in this room that need to experience that love in the deepest place of who they are. And sometimes we need to demonstrate with our bodies what our hearts want. So I just invite you to worship in this song that has impacted me and wrecked me all week.
I can be real with you. Say anything and I won't be afraid. You made me and you like what you make. You made me and you don't make mistakes. I can be real with you. You take me just as I am. You choose me all over again. I am the one you love. I am the one you love. still make my Father smile. I know you're proud of me. You take me just as I am. You choose me all over again. I am the one you love. I am the one you love. I don't have to prove anything. There's room at your table for me. I am the one you love. I am the one you love. You take me just as I am and choose me all over again. I am the one you love. I am the one you love. I don't have to prove anything. There's room at your table for me. I am the one you love. I am the one you love. The one you love. You know everything and you still love me. You know everything and you still love me. It's your love never fails. Your love never fails. Your love never fails. Your love never fails. It's infinite. Your love never fails. Your love never fails. You never fail. Your love never fails. Your love never fails. Oh, your love never fails. Your love never fails. Never has failed me once. Your love never fails. Your love never fails. Even when I do. Your love never fails. Your love never fails. Mighty love. Your love never fails. Your love never fails.